So what would what would a worldview based in love look like, right? And what would happen if enough people chose that, right? We're not talking about 100% of the human population, but a critical mass of people. If even just the people who say they're all about love and they're all about equal rights and they want justice, if only even those folks were to coherently base their worldview on love, what would happen? Because right now, a lot of people do contradict themselves. And they might not even be aware that statism is based entirely on coercion, which ultimately is the threat of violence, right? Coercion is the threat of harm in general, but when, just on the level, again, of how the state raises funds, it comes with the threat of fines. If you don't pay those fines, well, then you can be dispossessed, you can be abducted, incarcerated, and all of those threats are backed up with the threat of violence, that if you don't comply, that agents of the state have the right to do violence onto you to enforce your obedience. And so that's when you break it down to really what the ingredients, the behaviors that comprise government, it is ultimately all resting on the threat of violence or the initiation of violence. That's where the state derives its authority. And so you might ask, well, how can we, as the so-called citizens, delegate that authority to the state if we don't have it ourselves, right? If you don't have the right to do those things to your fellow human beings and your neighbors, how would you have the right to vote for a system or for a group of people to do those things to your neighbor? How can you delegate rights that you don't have? And we'll return to this point as we go, because it's very important to sit with that, because the human species has, of course, lived under various ruling class systems for thousands of years. And at one point, of course, and we'll return to this point as we go as well, but at one point, the monarchs had claimed the right to rule over humanity by divine right, that they had the divine right to rule, that God had ordained them to rule over the masses, right? And we were supposed to believe this. The people alive at that time were supposed to believe that. And some did, some didn't, but apparently enough went along with it that it continued. And at some point or another, the narrative shifted to the fact that, or to the notion that the people, the voters, are giving the members of the ruling class the authority to do what they do. That it's no longer ordained by God, but rather granted by the masses through the voting process. But what that ignores is that we ourselves don't have that authority over each other. So what right do we have to impose such a system on others? Because obviously when one is voting, one is not only voting for a system that affects you, but it affects everyone else. So, we'll come back to that. But it's just to say that delegating rights that you don't even have is not a worldview based on love, right? So, because if you don't have the right to do those things, why do members of government have the right? And how could you have given them the right to do that if they don't have the right? So maybe it's more reasonable to say that they don't have the right to do what they do either, because we would all have equal rights as human beings, right? And in other words, we all have the equal right to be left alone from domination. right? Because rights, I guess it's important to get into a working definition of a human right. But so long as you're not initiating harm to other people, you're within your rights. So just to really simplify what we're talking about, it's the right to be left alone from all forms of enslavement and domination. And to honor every human being's right to be left alone from domination would be a worldview based in love. But a statist worldview does not honor that. So it's important to sit with that and say, and work that out. Because just like other worldviews based in domination, sexism, racism, classism, religious fanaticism, an imperialistic nationalism, all these kind of worldviews, they too are based in domination. But even a lot of people would recognize that and yet still condone the existence of government just because it's so normalized. And yet that worldview too also ignores this principle of justice and equality under a natural law, that we are all inherently sovereign, that no one has the right to be the owner, master, or ruler of another. So if we listen to our heart, right, and if it is about honoring equal rights, and if the state is in opposition to this law of love, if it stands in violation to it, what conclusion does that lead us to? And this is just the nature of love, and it is both. To base one's worldview on love obviously comes down to non-aggression, right? To not initiate violence to others, to not harm them, to not psychologically or physically abuse people. But it's also to honor self-defense from enslavement. So people do have the right to defend themselves and each other from domination, but not the right to, initiate that and dominate others. And we will get into, the difference between violence and self-defense in greater detail, because it's important to iron that out. But I generally don't even use the term overthrow the state, because it conjures for people maybe, people just going out with guns tomorrow and trying to abolish the state that way, when in reality, the numbers are not there. So much work would have to be done in consciousness before strength in numbers is even there, that a self-defensive effort would even be successful. And there's also, the reality that a lot of people are dependent upon the state for their survival, right? And so it's not to forget about those folks and throw them under the bus, right? Obviously, so much evolution would have to take place in consciousness before we could co-evolve beyond this current system. And then in that moment of upheaval, look out for each other and help each other survive through that period of upheaval. But obviously, there's a lot of legwork to do in consciousness to even be the kind of people who in the aggregate would unite and would base their worldview on love, would base their words on love, would base their actions on love. But, a whole entire system based on coercion, which is the central principle of all government, even though, of course, some governments are more murderous than others, some are more fascist than others, but they're all based on coercion, which is domination, which is threatening harm to people to enforce obedience. That is, threatening harm to enforce obedience has nothing to do with love. And we just have to choose at some point what, it's one thing to admit that you don't want to base your worldview on love, and you don't want to base human coexistence on love, and you don't think that's a good idea, and just say it. You want control. You want people to be controlled by a ruling class. At least admit it. But if you're going to say you want love, if you're going to say you want equality and justice, then sit with that contradiction of basing your entire worldview on coercion for the human species, when you would probably know better than to base an interpersonal interaction on coercion, right? So many people would recognize coercion as being illegitimate and unjust between two people, and yet proceed to base their worldview for the entire human species on coercion, on the coercive extraction of labor and the coercive process of a governing class that has the authority to pass laws that apply to people's bodies against their will and obliterate their consent. So, and that is just the nature of government, right? Government, of course, is just a group of people who we call the government, who call themselves the government. They're only people like the rest of us. Why do they have the right to rule over people? How is that different in principle than any other ideology of domination that says, well, this group of people gets to dominate that group of people because of whatever pretext you come up with? This thing called authority is really in the way of people honoring the inherent sovereignty of their, fellow human beings. To imagine that just because you have a badge or a uniform, or just because you have this certain status, or people checked a box next to your name on a piece of paper on a ballot, and just because of these kinds of rituals and costumes, that those people have rights that no one else has. They have the right to dominate. They have the right to coerce. They have the right to enforce obedience to whatever their dictates happen to be, as long as they can pass a law that is enforced by the law enforcers, right? As long as they can get a law passed, and as long as they can get people to enforce it, you have to obey it, or else harm will be done to you. And yet, what does that have to do with love, which is a pre-existing principle, not something we invented, but something that's here, intrinsic to the universe, something that would exist even without humanity here to experience it. We can see, animals also experience love, but they didn't invent it either. Love is a natural phenomenon, just like light or sound or gravity, or these principles that are built in. So from that perspective, we can come to see that the law is pre-existing. This law of love, or in other words, that we're not each other's slaves, or we're not each other's owners, that is a pre-existing law that would be true no matter where we met, no matter what the context was, whether it was hundreds of thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years into the future. I wouldn't own you. You wouldn't be my slave legitimately. I could claim it, but it wouldn't be true. and I'm not your slave, and that's true for everyone else. And that's always been true. It's just unfortunately not been honored by, enough people. So, instead of basing coexistence on a pre-existing law, this law of love, we have acquiesced en masse to political law, which is such that those in power get to make the law. They decide what the law is. They're, of course, playing God in that role, saying, I'm the lawmaker. I can say, on one hand, something that's true, like people don't have the right to murder each other. It's illegal, right? So it's true, that law would be in keeping with this natural law, but it would be redundant. In other words, it's not true because people in power wrote it down or passed the law. It was already true. It doesn't mean one shouldn't write it down and communicate it, but it is highly presumptuous and highly dangerous to imagine that it's true because you wrote it down, that the law ultimately flows from your dictates, and whatever you decide the law is becomes the law because you are in power. So that's the world, of course, that's been mounted. Is, it does get down to some people claiming to be God, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people believing in that authority, right? And even that word authority, it implies to be the author of the law. And we can, over the course of presentation, discuss nuances, discuss what people might consider gray areas of right and wrong and all of this, but you would get a very large percentage of people to say that, domestic abuse is wrong. And so the government may say domestic abuse is illegal, and in that sense, in that case, they what they identify the law to be is in keeping with this natural law. But because they have claimed the authority to determine what the law is, now they can also pass laws that are in opposition to this natural law. So they could say, well, murder is wrong when you do it, but as long as we do it, it's okay. And of course, members of government do the bulk of mass murder on Earth, right? And they call it war, and yet it's led to hundreds of millions of murders. And but those in power claim the legal authority to carry out that murder because they've waged war, right? And they'll come up with some pretext of self-defense, even though it's it's so often in a war of aggression. And so you see that double standard there again. So this is the danger of imagining that law flows from the dictates of people, rather than recognizing justice as a science, much like physics or justice or these kinds of pre-existing principles. It's not to say, if you can, obviously our interpretation of physics will change over time, and Newtonian physics, of course, was challenged by quantum physics, right? And that what was decoded through quantum physics calls into question the interpretation, the previous interpretation of what this law was. But that's our relationship to the law, right? That's not to say we are the inventors of the law. we might change our perspective on the law, but it's trying to understand something that's already there. We can discover these principles in nature, but that's different from imagining that we are the arbiter or inventor of those laws. Because if we're discovering them, that would mean they're already there. And if we approach justice as a science like any other, that it doesn't require belief. In other words, it's our approach to decoding this law of love or justice ought to be falsifiable. It ought to be evidence-based. But when you look at harm in the world, it is evidence-based. It's not, the wounds are real, the blood is real, the suffering is real, the poverty is real, the murder is real, right? We're not talking about mental constructs. We're talking about things that take place in the real world that are measurable and knowable. And the human history serves as that scientific experiment, if you will, to show what happens when people behave this way or versus that way. When people do not honor each other's freedom. Look at the slavery they create. Look at the suffering and trauma and anguish they create. So that's a very different approach to justice. So it's funny because even on the level of, let's say, jury duty, right? I received a letter from the state recently requesting that I come in on a certain day to perform my jury duty, right? And I noticed that on the letters, it also stated that if I were to ignore this, that would be punishable with a $1,000 fine or up to 30 days in prison. So the implication, again, even though they don't come out and say it, is I own you. So if you don't participate in my process of justice, what I'm calling justice, right? And I'm speaking now from the perspective of those in the state, right? If you don't participate in my version of justice, I'm going to make you give me money. Which is an implicit claim on your time and labor, which is by extension an claim of ownership on your body, right? Or I'll just come and abduct you and put you in a cage. And those are the people that we're supposed to trust to deliver justice when their whole premise of justice hinges on coercion and the threat of harm, and which is already unjust. Imagine if you approach anyone that way for any other reason, right? Like, would you please shop at my farmer's market? I have really good fresh fruit. Oh, by the way, if you don't, I'm gonna put you in a cage. Right? Would you please be in my band? I want to start a band. Would you consider playing in it? Oh, by the way, if you don't, I'm gonna put you in a cage. Just go down the list of any kind of offer or any kind of request or a request for a contribution from someone, and you, instead of honoring their inherent freedom in your exchange with them, instead of respecting their humanity, you instead say, oh, by the way, but if you don't, I'm going to put you in a cage. And so this is just an example. It's jury duty, which is, threatening harm to enforce that would be considered a minor example in what the state does and as far as the harm it perpetrates. And yet even a minor example like that reveals the immoral nature of the whole enterprise. So people might say, well, what are you, some kind of anarchist or something? And, well, in fact, that word does accurately describe freedom. if we break that word down to, its etymological root meaning, an is without and archy is rulership, right? That's why, of course, a monarchy is the rule by a king or queen, ruled by one. Oligarchy is ruled by a few, which is what all forms of government are. Patriarchy, ruled by men. Matriarchy would be ruled by women, right? And some people reject all of that and says, well, we don't actually need a ruling class. I don't think that could ever be moral, no matter who sits on that throne. It's the throne itself that is illegitimate, because it's not just a question of who has power over others, but the very notion that someone should have power over someone else is already in violation to love. So even though this word is charged and people might assume you're talking about something else entirely, which this meme shows, people often think that's what anarchy is, a group of people with weapons who are coming to enslave and steal and spread chaos and mayhem and just do whatever they want regardless of the consequences to others. That is not anarchy, because anarchy is without rulers. And if these people are coming to rule over others, they're not respecting the first principle within anarchism, which would be to not rule over others. So from that sense, what is anarchism really refer to? If it's advocating for a coexistence in which we honor equal rights, where no one is the master of anyone else. Wouldn't a synonym for that be freedom? Isn't that all we're talking about? And so you might not even want to use this word, so you avoid all the connotations that that this word may conjure in people's minds. But then again, if you use the word freedom, that too requires clarification, because people might assume you mean, doing whatever you want regardless of the consequences. But if you're destroying other people's freedom in the process, well, you're not co-creating freedom. Freedom is a mutual thing, right? So if I'm destroying your rights and your freedom and calling that freedom, I'm dominating you. I'm enslaving you, which is not freedom. I'm profiting off someone else's hardship and just calling that freedom, even though that's not what freedom looks like at all. So freedom is not doing whatever you want regardless of the consequences. It is to take into account the consequences your actions have on others, right? So then we can co-create freedom, and we do it all the time anyway. And this is what the bottom half of the meme shows, is that what could be called anarchy or freedom, or voluntary coexistence, right, is totally ubiquitous already. It's widespread at an interpersonal level, even though it's not what is going down at a societal level at all. But interpersonally, people already experience anarchy all the time. So anytime anyone is refraining from dominating or enslaving others, when no one is being dominated by anyone else, any interaction where that is taking place is already anarchy. And such a scene as what this bottom photo shows is that's totally commonplace throughout the world. You can go all over the world, and not to say every corner of the earth would be like that right now, but it's just to say you can go throughout the world and see people walking down the street, not enslaving anyone, no one raping or murdering or assaulting or stealing from anyone. You can see people at a farmer's market. You can see people sit down next to perfect strangers on a bus or a train, or at an event, at a concert, at a movie theater, and trust that this stranger sitting next to them is not going to rape or murder or torture or enslave them. right? And so we already do it, and it's considered the norm when that is taking place, and when obviously assault does happen among people on the street, and theft and enslavement, right, does also happen. But it's people would generally recognize that as harmful and wrong. So then that would indicate, if you think that is wrong when people are dominating others, then that would indicate that you're already an anarchist at heart. So yeah, we largely already know how to do it, to co-create a voluntary coexistence where we exchange and interact voluntarily and consensually. Many of us already seem to recognize that it's when people don't do that, they're abusive. So why not extrapolate that? Why not base one's entire worldview on what you already know to be true interpersonally? What changes when we're talking about a larger group of people? What sense is it to say, well, okay, interpersonally amongst each other, we should respect each other's human rights, right? But for humanity at large, when we're dealing with that many people, I do think we need a ruling class, and we do need to be controlled and coerced and dominated, because otherwise, we're just too dangerous to be free. But what could be more dangerous than that? Basing your worldview on some people dominating others, don't you think that will cause a cycle of abuse and danger and chaos? Hasn't it? Hasn't it done just that? So again, bringing it back to love. They fear love because it creates a world they can't control. And you might ask, well, who's they? Well, that could be anyone in power, anyone who is of that psychopathic mindset that they do want to dominate people, conquer, invade, divide, enslave people for their own profit, for their own control freak superiority complex, to feed their own diseased mindset. But it could also be any abuser at all, whether it's in a household or in the halls of power. Love is threatening to a narcissistic, psychopathic abuser, because the more you love yourself, the less you will tolerate that abuse. The more you love others, the less you will tolerate their abuse, and the more you would want to unite with them against that abuse. But if they can keep people in fear, it's easier to control them. And that's true between one person dominating another, or it's also true at a societal level of a dominator class trying to conquer people. It's a very important point to emphasize, because whether we call it anarchist or not, again, the label is really not the important part. It does accurately refer to a philosophy of freedom. But other words do it too, like freedom, like sovereignty, like people call it voluntarism, or voluntary a voluntary society is what they're trying to work towards. People call it abolition, being an abolitionist against all forms of enslavement, being an advocate for freedom. However you want to articulate that, how many of us were born with that capacity to experience, to empathize with the suffering of others? How many of us were born with the capacity to resent being dominated oneself? That principle of justice, that self-defensive or protective spirit that tells you that it's not right when people are enslaved and bullied. That is that principle of love, right? And we may have that inside us, and yet there's a lot of ideology, a lot of things we learn that may try to distract us from that or cover that up, and to the point where the ideologies we adopt are not truly aligned with what our heart knows to be true. But all of that is changeable, because the way education is approached is changeable. And if people were to affirm the conscience of the next generations, as opposed to clouding it and covering it up, whether you know it or not, or just passing on things that you learn, but it contains that ingredient of domination, whatever ideology you're passing on, well, that confuses the mindset of people growing up in this world, and we're dragged away or led away from that eternal principle that no one is the slave of anyone else. And we could do better. We could co-create a much freer world. It'd never be perfect, but we could do a whole lot better if we would, affirm a force which is already inside most people at birth. Yeah, there are primary psychopaths, people who are born without the capacity for conscience, but the majority of infants are born with the capacity. So why not nurture and develop that and encourage and affirm that, rather than confuse and distract and cloud and erode and chip away at that force? So again, not about the label, but this word does accurately refer to a genuine philosophy of freedom, where we honor the fact that no one owns anyone else legitimately. No one ever has, and no one ever will. I don't own you, you don't own me, we don't own them, they don't own us. We have a responsibility to each other. It's not to say I can do whatever I want regardless of the consequences to others, but I don't own them, they don't own me. In fact, to act that way where I can do whatever I want, no matter how much suffering and trauma and abuse it creates for others, would be to imply that I own them, that I can determine the fate of their bodies, of their lives. Of course, we affect each other, we influence each other, we're interconnected, but there is nevertheless a sacred boundary where your body is not my property. Therefore, consent is required for what you do with your own body. And government just does not respect that. And various ideologies of domination do not respect that. And that needs to be exposed. So more soon, and we'll pick back up along these lines in the next video.